We know that Jesus was a storyteller. He was a master storyteller, actually. But he also had this kind of maddening habit, sometimes at least, of answering questions with stories. Now, looking back, we can appreciate this as a teaching device. But at the time, at least, to those in the audience around him, I could see that it might have been frustrating. Just imagine you're at the hardware store. You're looking at paint chips, and you ask your spouse, "What color do you think we should paint the living room?" And your spouse answers, "There once was a man driving from here to Burlington." I realized this week this is how we know that Jesus was never married, because he would have learned not to answer questions that way. But lucky for us, looking back 2,000 years, that he did. It's lucky because the stories make the lesson memorable. Sometimes, of course, these stories can obscure it a little bit. Because the fact that we're looking at these homespun lessons from a culture that we've never experienced, that were originally taught in a language we don't know, and then translated by scholars who are sometimes just making the best guess that they can, that can make things a little tricky sometimes to understand. So sometimes, far from making the point obvious, these parables make things harder for us as disciples of Jesus. And when you're preaching, or when you're teaching from these parables, that can be a flaw. But it also is brilliance, because it means that we have to work that much harder to dig into them and understand. So today's gospel lesson from Luke, and Luke's the only one who records this particular story. This gospel lesson today is one that's near and dear to anybody who's been involved in church any amount of time. Parable of the Good Samaritan. It says so right on the label. Most translations that we see today are going to have that title of the story. And it's come to be taught that way in church and in Sunday school for generation upon generation, going back many, many years. In fact, Mrs. Kieselhorst, my long-suffering kindergarten and first-grade Sunday school teacher, taught us the story with that title. And as good Sunday school teachers do, she strove to make us understand how important it is for us to emulate the Good Samaritan. Indeed, the story itself is so ingrained in our culture that the term Good Samaritan has come to mean somebody who happens upon an accident or upon somebody in need and then takes action to help them. And that's cool. That's one of the ways the Bible has seeped into culture. But when you dig into it, that's not precisely what the story is about. It's not exactly the lesson that Jesus was teaching. So let's dispense with the title, first of all, Good Samaritan. For the most part, Jesus didn't name his parables. His disciples didn't name his parables. Names weren't assigned to the lessons of Jesus until some 400 years or so after they were first taught. These titles that we see started appearing about the time the current chapter and verse headings were put in, sometime in the 5th century. Because originally most text from that time was just that. It was long lines of text, just line after line after line, unbroken. Very difficult to read. So scholars got the very intelligent, bright idea of putting in breaks for verses and chapters and naming particular things so we would know what they were about. it also means they're putting their imprint on the message. And it's important in this case because Good Samaritan, that term, doesn't really address the more visceral meaning of the parable. Take it apart a little bit today. Different preachers and teachers and different writers approaching this tale come at it from different vantage points. And over the years, I'm sure you've heard most of them. One interpretation of the story is that the priest and the Levite placed Jewish purity laws against doing what's right. They tell us that the first two passers-by, the priest and the Levite, avoid coming to the aid of the victim because when they see him in the distance, they think that he might be dead. And if he's dead, they don't want to touch him and become unclean, so they cross to the other side. And the kernel of truth to that idea is that priests were supposed to avoid contact with corpses except for their close relatives. And that's an appealing interpretation because it fits with the idea of Jesus teaching the elders, or actually kind of putting his thumb in the eye of the elders and saying, you guys have this wrong, you're focusing on the wrong faith. It's an interpretation I've used myself, I've preached on it. Turns out there's a couple of problems with that interpretation. First, we're told that the priest and the Levite are going from Jerusalem to Jericho, so they're off duty from the temple. They don't need to worry at that point about becoming ritually unclean. Moreover, and this is the clincher, according to Dr. Amy Jill Levine, who was writing the Biblical Archaeology Review. According to Dr. Levine, contemporary Jewish law, 1st century, said that saving a life trumped all other law. And the Mishnah, which was the earliest compilation of rabbinic law, states that even a high priest should attend a neglected corpse. So the law said they should have helped. Now, other interpretations focus on the idea that the Samaritan was a social outcast, the kind of person who wasn't accepted in like first century Jewish society. And there's a kernel again of truth to that. But it also misses the point. And the point is that the Samaritans and the Jews in the first century weren't estranged. They were enemies. They may have shared some common heritage. They might have shared some common language. And they may have even worshipped the same God, sort of, in different ways in different places. They were enemies. And that's where the twist in Jesus' tale of the Samaritan comes. And Jesus sets it up very skillfully, because on this long road to Jericho, out in the desolate wilderness, it's this 18-mile trek from Jerusalem to Jericho. Like walking from here to Lake Geneva. In this long, desolate stretch, this man is attacked and beaten and stripped and robbed and left for dead. And then two righteous, upstanding men, whom you would take to be pillars of the community, come upon him and instead of helping, they cross to the other side of the road to avoid him. And to the crowd listening to this 2,000 years ago, the buildup would be there. Okay, there's one good guy, he doesn't help. There's another good guy, he doesn't help. What's the next good guy going to do? And Jesus takes it and he twists it. That Jesus would choose a Samaritan as the hero of the story was every bit as shocking to his audience as a contemporary version would be if we would say a gangbanger chose to stop and hell. Or an Islamic terrorist or a child molester stopped and turned out to be the hero of the story. The audience at the time was left asking, how could this be? Jesus, this makes no sense. How could this bottom-feeding piece of garbage possibly be the good guy? What's Jesus trying to pull here? And if it sounds harsh to say it that way, realize that's the context of the time. The impact that the parable would have had. For many people, I'm guessing many people walked away from it just shaking their heads and saying, okay, this Jesus kind of lost it. He's not making a lot of sense. Because everybody knows these people, these Samaritans, are beyond redemption. They would never behave in such a humane way. And that also was Jesus' point. Not just that we should render aid. The point was who might do it. Now remember, the question that kicked off this story was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? That's how it's rendered in most translations. The interesting thing is that the Greek phrase that's rendered eternal life is aionios zoe. And if you look at how that's used elsewhere in the New Testament, you could better interpret that probably as what must I do to achieve a spiritual life, or what must I do to live the life of the redeemed. So this lawyer is not talking about how do I get to heaven. He's saying, how do I live a life that takes in these things that you're trying to teach us? And in answering, Jesus tells them the story of a Samaritan. An enemy, a bad dude, despicable human being, turning out to be capable of figuring out what to do. And we learn that the key to achieving a spiritual life, this kind of life that Jesus was trying to lead the people toward, the key is threefold. First of all, to see. To recognize human need and human loss when you see it. To see the brokenness of humankind in all of its forms and the lives of those who have fallen. To approach. To draw near to those who are in need instead of stepping away, instead of recoiling from them. To actually muster the courage and the heart to step toward the need instead of away from it. And the third part is to give of yourself. To make yourself vulnerable in the reaching out to the others. To expose yourself to whatever might happen so that you can touch and help another human being in need. Because the work of the kingdom is to bring relief where there is need. It's to bring joy where there is sadness, and above all, it's to bring ourselves to be present in the midst of heartbreak, and in the midst of tragedy, and in the midst of hurt. Because there's nothing quite as powerful and as spiritually fortifying as human presence. Somebody's hurting. There's nothing quite as meaningful as knowing that somebody has stepped out of their way to help you. A long time ago, when I was young, my junior year in high school, our Spanish club and Spanish clubs of several other schools in the area, we went on a trip to Mexico. It was spring break, we went down to Mexico City. We took a bus, which is every bit as fun as you would think it was. We left on Friday. We got there, I think, on Easter Sunday. We left on Good Friday, got there on Easter Sunday. We got into the hotel, we got our stuff in, and then the first stop on that trip was to go to a place called Xochimilco. It's a tourist spot in Mexico City. It's floating gardens. Sort of a lake and channels, and they have these floating islands of gardens, and you go there and you visit and you take in the scenery and you eat lunch. That's what we did. All of us on the bus, we got our box lunches from the hotel. And we spent some time there, and then the time came for all of us to go on to the next thing, and we were all called back to the bus. And high school students, being what they are, most of us didn't finish our lunches. So we had these box lunches, and some of them had a partially eaten sandwich, and some had a partially eaten apple in it. All the different sort of stuff that ends up in the garbage. And we were good students. We threw all of our stuff in the garbage. And as we walked across the parking lot and was getting onto the bus, something called me, and I turned around. And I saw that all of the local kids there were digging through the garbage, pulling out what we hadn't eaten and eating it themselves. That's what they needed to do. And I remember getting on the bus and thinking about that the rest of the day. And if I could go back now and say something to my 17-year-old self, there's probably a lot of things I would tell myself, but I would miss it. But if I could go back to that moment, I would say, turn around, get off the bus, and go and help them. Whatever money you've got in your wallet, give it to them. Buy food for them. Do something. Because they need help. In the end, we can't help everyone. That doesn't excuse us from helping somebody. In the course of our lives, we run across people probably every day who need some help. Human contact, human touch, just a kind word. But often we get too busy to take time out to do that. And what Jesus would tell us is, take that time. Take that time. Reach out to somebody who's hurting. You might be the only one. That's the right thing to do. Jesus would say, even a Samaritan